This evening being the 12th of April 2026, I am more or less going to dive straight in back into the content that is about Mircea Eliade, the Forge and the Crucible, origins and structures of alchemy. Again, the invitation is to go back to alchemy to the depths, because I don't have time to really go into why I feel that this content is important. What I would say just briefly is that I've been talking a lot about matter, embodiment, the material world. And this chapter 3, entitled The World Sexualized, in a hopefully non-Freudian way, goes quite deep into the depth of our kinship, our bond with the natural world. I've got the hiccups at the moment because I just ate dinner, and I don't know. I don't have to give a reason why I have hiccups, that's something that's going on. Anyway, let's go. I'm gonna be like, yeah, reading sentence by sentence, and I think Eliade's content is super interesting. So I'm trying to draw out the mythology that reveals our nascent and subconscious sense of our profound kinship with the world itself, by which I mean the natural world or the material world. And again, this is in the context of sort of, hey, how can we wake ourselves up? Because we need to. And it's not just about waking up in here, it's about waking up as all of this. And this mythology is deadly relevant to that project. Quote, when we talk of the sexualization of the vegetable world, it's necessary to be as clear as to the precise meaning of the term as possible. It's not a question of the actual phenomenon of the fertilization of plants, but of a, quote, qualitative morphological classification, which is the culmination and expression of an experience of mystical sympathy with the world. It's the idea of life which, projected onto the cosmos, sexualizes it. Okay, so what he's drawing on here is, again, we were talking about the relationship that we have to meteorites, historically speaking, that they become associated with the sense of sacredness and with our religious practice. And what's relevant about that is that that kind of experience got projected onto matter. And so by examining in some exhaustive detail the shifts and changes in our relationship with the material world, we can make sense of what I'm saying there is that the threads of our mythology, which relate to the shifts in our religious practice, they draw out or speak from the depths of our being, which is a rather obvious point to make. So what do I mean specifically by this? So, for example, when we consider the sexualization of the world, it's not just a projection. It's if anyone wants to go into why it's not just projection, the video Jung on astrology goes into that in some detail. There is a shared experience. The cosmos is organized in a sexual way. It's possible to notice that. And recognizing it in the world, recognizing that quality in the world, reveals our profound kinship with it. And it also it points to a layer of our identity, which is identification as life itself. Again, quote, it is the idea of life which, projected onto the cosmos, sexualizes it. It's not quite the idea of life. What he's getting at here, and again, this is obviously me interpreting Eliade at this point, there's such a close association between sexuality, you could say eros in a word, and life. Nietzsche talked about how life's goal or purpose was to give vent to itself, give expression to itself. And it's kind of about that. It's this idea that when we recognize the sexuality which is inherent within the world, we're also recognizing that within ourselves. We feel profoundly bonded to the world in recognition of that quality. And the place from which we're bonded is this kinship based on the common identity of being alive. So the idea is that that which is alive is in a way a being. It's not just about kinship. It's not just about bondedness in a sense of sharing the same idea or sharing the same orientation to life. It's actually being bonded existentially, being bonded in the depths of who we are. And the recognition of sexuality in the world is a kind of self-recognition in that sense. And that's expressed, that self-recognition is expressed in mythological form. The being that is life expresses that life, expresses its being in the form of sexuality, and has the potential to recognize that. When we analyze the myths of the world sexualized, they point to that. Quote, it's not a matter of making objective or scientific observations, but of arriving at an appraisal of the world around us in terms of life. Arriving at an appraisal of the world around us in terms of life and in terms of anthropocosmic destiny, embracing sexuality, fecundity, death, and rebirth. What this is pointing to is that I'm talking about a mode of perception and cognition that is inherent within this kind of mythology and mythological thinking. And that mode of perception and cognition, it appraises the world in a non-scientific way. So it's about taking a different perspective, in addition to being able to take up scientific perspectives. But from this perspective, we appraise the world in terms of, what are we doing here? What's the point of all of this? All this life. What's this all going toward? What are we accelerating toward? And this kind of appraisal is based on this deep recognition that all of life is going somewhere. Which is actually a deeply non-scientific because the scientists think that it's all random and that it's a random walk, technically speaking. And I think rather than simply accept that as this is what the priests in the white cloaks tell us, it's worth actually asking from a deeply existential place. Is there a direction to all this? Quote, not that, again, this is written in 1957, so again, please try to be forgiving of 56. We try to be forgiving of Eliade. Quote, not that men in primitive societies were incapable of objectively observing the life of plants. The proof of this is the discovery and artificial fertilization and grafting of date and fig trees in Mesopotamia. These processes had long been known, for at least 2 paragraphs of the Hammurabi Code legislate on this point. Okay, so here, what he's taken it toward is that there's a kind of mode of perception that we have lost. and that there was a scientific kind of perception that was available to people before formal science, as we understand it, was invented. But we've lost something. And so he talks about this deep involvement that we have with nature, which is it's scientific in a practical way. That, for example, grafting is quite technical, right? And it was known for a long time and quite handed down to the Hebrews and the Arabs. Passing here that the time that he's throwing back to is a time when this practical natural knowledge, which he describes as kind of proto-scientific, is already written down. It's already legislated. And I think that's a kind of it's an issue because when we write down law, such as like practical knowledge of how to work with plants and so on, they don't work in all times and places. Which is why that horticultural knowledge was passed down practically as an element of cultural transmission that was learned directly from other people. When we start to define it and write it down, we're already on the path to assuming that knowledge is something that can be decontextualized. And I view that as a kind of mistake. He said, quote, the artificial fertilization of fruit trees was not looked upon as a horticultural technique efficient in itself, but as a ritual. The fact that it involved vegetable fertility implied man's sexual participation. Orgiastic practices associated with earthly fertility or with agriculture have been abundantly attested in the history of religions. So again, he's talking about a deep kind of participation, participatory knowledge. It's not the way that knowledge was stored around that time and before that point was in the form of participation in specific rituals that not only preserved knowledge, but enacted it. What we lost was the ritual contexts that facilitated that. We came to believe that our knowledge could be merely believed, and we were wrong. And so what we lost was not only a mode of perception, a kind of self-recognition of ourselves within nature, but we lost a deep kind of participation, a kind of religious practice that allowed us to feel that we are that world with which we interact. And we lost at the same time specific knowledge. And this kind of mythology that he's harking back to points to that and reveals it. He goes on, quote, it will suffice to quote one example connected with the grafting of citrus and orange trees in order to illustrate the ritualistic character of this process. Ibn Washar, in his quote, book concerning Nabaean agriculture, as depicted for us the customs of the peasants of Mesopotamia, Persia, and Egypt. The book is now lost, but from the fragments quoted by Maimonides, it's possible to appreciate the nature of the superstitions surrounding the fertilization and grafting of fruit trees in the Near East. According to Maimonides, Jews were forbidden to use lemons from grafted trees in order to safeguard them against the possible imitation of the orgiastic practices obtaining among neighboring peoples. So what I saw in this is, well, there's a kind of purity code which is implied in this behavior, right? Which is like, here's what you can do and here's what you can't do. And those kind of boundaries have been the core, the essence of human culture for longer than there have been Homo sapiens. Literally, like the particular category boundaries, like this is what one thing is, and this is what another thing is, has to be decided because whenever we encounter a new object, we fit it into one of those pre-existing categories of knowledge. It's kind of like this thing that we already know, so we'll just treat it in the same way because it's more efficient to do that. Not only that kind of knowledge classification, but also boundaries that have to do with our behavior, as in, this is the way that we do it, that's the way that they do it over there. Don't make the mistake of doing it like them because here it's different. And there are reasons. The whole point of this is that the specific cultural practices are relevant to particular places. So even though there might be like customs and traditions that build up over time that are important for purely cultural reasons, there are also reasons that behaviors are different in different parts of the world because the place is different. And the trees, for example, which are there, require a different manner of tending. And taboo codes, purity codes, boundaries, in a word, they point to that. I'll move on here. He says, this guy that he was talking about, Ibn Washia, and he is not the only Oriental writer to allow himself to be carried away by such images, speaks of fantastic graftings, contrary to nature, between differing vegetable species. He says, for instance, the grafting of a branch of a lemon tree onto a laurel or olive tree would produce very small lemons, the size of olives. But he makes it clear that the graft could succeed only if it was performed in the ritual manner and at a certain conjunction of sun and moon. He explains the rite thus. The branch to be grafted must be held in the hands of a very beautiful maiden, while a man is having shameful and unnatural sexual intercourse with her. During coitus, the girl grafts the branch onto the tree. Gosh, how do I... The significance is clear. In order to ensure an unnatural union in the vegetable world, an unnatural sexual union between human beings was necessary. So we would now understand that to be total bullshit, right? But the point is that there was a cultural tradition, a practice involving a specific rite or ritual that had built up around that time that reveals and points to the kind of knowledge that I'm trying to talk about. It was a knowledge that takes place by participation, and it involves like when there's again, it's alchemical in the sense that there's a desire to intervene in a natural process in a way that shifts and changes it in some way. And the recognition that there's a specific way of doing that. And regardless of whether that actually worked or not, that was the instinct that they had. And it was built into the not only instinct, but their culture, their custom, and specific ritual. It's an intervention in nature which is built around a very specific theme, which is that there is a kinship or bond, a deep bond, a bond of identity and existential participation between humankind and the world or the natural world, which leads to a certain that recognition leads to a certain kind of belief that if we're trying to intervene in nature in a certain way so as to achieve something, well, we in a sense have to embody that or model that. But I'll keep going. Quote, this way of looking at the universe differs radically, of course, from one which permits and encourages the objective observation of the life of plants. Again, it's not so much about a scientific way of looking at something. It's a different form of knowledge. And literally, like I could deepen it by making observations like it is quite hard to, I mean, not being someone who is a horticulturalist, right? It's quite hard to simply graft one type of fruit tree to another. And sometimes it's the kind of thing where sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And it really matters because if you can do it successfully, then you get a whole bunch more fruit, right? And so it stands to reason that there would be experts, right, who would try to do that in the best ways that were available to them. And at that time, right, a lot of knowledge was stored ritually and in terms of specific practices. And the fact that we would regard them as superstition and ineffective It in a way it's a deep kind of misrecognition of what's actually going on there. What it comes back to is the kind of recognition that if we want to intervene in nature in a way which is, let's say, mutually beneficial to ourselves and nature, well, there's a specific way of doing that that works and other ways which don't work. And people try to find that through practice. Religious practice, the practice of specific rites and rituals. It's a way of like in that context, like the fact that knowledge was stored in such rites and rituals, not just in their beliefs, was it kind of comes out of the idea that of the law of the land. And I guess I can sort of gesture over to Tyson Yunkaporta and other indigenous scholars who have written about this stuff. It's the idea that our knowledge is stored in deep, close, personal relationship with the particular land that is ours to care for. Um, rather than being something which is scientific that you can read in a book that is equally applicable in all times and places. It's a different kind of knowledge, which is why he says this way of looking at the universe radically differs, of course, from one which permits and encourages the objective observation of the life of plants. Like other peoples of the ancient Orient, the Mesopotamians employed the terms male and female in their classification of vegetable species. But this classification took into account the apparent morphological criteria and the place held by any given plant in certain magical operations. I'm going to keep going. It was thus, for example, that the cypress and mandragora were male, while the shrub nikibdu was considered male or female according to the form or ritual function assigned to it. So he's just talking about how our language really reflects this, like the way that we call and then relate to specific plants is deeply culturally contextual, but also the terms that we use, they allow us to, what would you say? The terms that we use facilitate the kind of participatory knowing that is essential to our really being in the world. So the language that we use matters. When we call things in a particular way, we understand it that way. Seems pretty obvious point, so I'm going to keep going. Analogous conceptions are to be found in ancient India. For example, Karaka, which is a person, I guess, knows the sexuality of plants, but Sanskrit terminology makes quite clear to us the primordial intuition which had led to this discovery. It was the comparison of vegetable species with human genital organs. So they're basically both symbols of viability, of vitality, of soul, of libido, of life. And that intuition recognizes that. So what I'm sort of saying here is that deep and in a sense it's primordial recognition of our not only kinship but existential identity with nature that's built into our language at a very deep level. It's built into our sexualizing of different plant species. When we relate to the world in terms of male and female, it's pointing to that level of depth of not only our self-conception, but our conception of the universe. It's pointing to the way that the universe is sexual. Eliade makes the same point. Are you ready? We're here dealing, therefore, with a general conception of cosmic reality seen as life, life capitalized, life deified. Cosmic reality seen as life, and consequently endowed with sex. sexuality being a particular sign of all living reality. Starting from a certain cultural level, the entire world, the world of nature, as well as the world of things and tools made by man, is presented as endowed with sex. Okay, so look, it's even actually different than what I was talking about. It's not just a self-recognition of, or it's not just, yeah. So what I was sort of saying was that life itself, all of life, is a kind of being that recognizes itself in this kind of mythology. When we recognize that which we share with life, that's a kind of self-recognition. And that's obviously present in our language and in our sexualizing of the world, mythologically and historically. But it's not just that, it's also recognizing all of being, all of creation as alive, recognizing it's a self-recognition of aliveness. Again, we talked earlier about how what alchemy was in a kind of intervention. It's a kind of impellation. We feel impelled to intervene in matter in such a way that fulfills or completes natural processes as a result of the recognition of aliveness and also sacredness. And we're talking here about the self-recognition of aliveness. When we see and when we feel and when we sense, when we know that everything is living, and it's like you can say, oh, yeah, but there are dead things out there. But it's not about that. It's like we experience those dead things that we call dead, from within this sphere of consciousness. Yes, there's a way that consciousness is foundational. The fact that we can have an experience of all these dead things is because we're in touch with that which is deeply living, that which is most alive, this core of aliveness. And those dead things participate in that aliveness, in our recognition of them as dead. The fact that we can even assign to them the quality of dead or not living is a product, is a result of there being life. What I'm saying is that the existential stance of life is something that precedes the categorical assigning of living and dead. Life as an attribution, that thing is alive, is derivative of that which is alive. I don't want to talk in a circle though, so quote. I'm just going to give some examples. I do quote the whole chapters of these because literally every line is important. And just because some of these lines don't give as much as others doesn't mean it's not worth quoting, in my opinion. There's so much packed in here. Quote, the examples which follow have been expressly selected from different cultural milieu so as to show how widespread and persistent such conceptions are. The Kitara, who are a people, divided ores, O-R-E-S, into male and female. So again, different kinds of metal. The former, male kinds of ores, hard and black, are found on the surface. The latter, female kinds of ores, were soft and red and were extracted from inside the mines. Quote, the mingling of the two sexes is indispensable to fruitful fusion. This is, of course, an objectively arbitrary classification, for neither the color nor the hardness of ores always corresponds to their sexual qualification. Quote, but it was the total union of reality which mattered, for it justified the right, R-I-T-E, namely the marriage of the metals. And this last made possible a birth. Okay, so there's something going on there mythologically, and we're trying to explore what it is. We don't understand it, so it's difficult to approach, which means we have to hold a lot of uncertainty before we come to a judgment about what's going on. So he's talking about a particular people called the Katara who divided the different types of metals that they found in the ground into male and female types of metals and talked about their mixing. So what's going on there? Why were we sexualizing metal objects in that way? Well, we're trying to find out. We're trying to investigate that. Quote, it was the total union of reality which mattered. What we're going to find is that it comes to the roots of metallurgy. So he says similar ideas are found in ancient China. Quote, you the great, literally, why you the great, the primeval smelter could distinguish male from female metals. And for this reason, he saw a parallel between his boilers and the two cosmological principles, yang and yin. We shall return later to the subject of Chinese metallurgical traditions, for the marriage of metals is a very ancient idea, which is continued and brought to a conclusion in the Mysterium Conjunctionis in Alchemy. So what Eliade is pointing to is Jung here. He's saying that these alchemical ideas were sort of part and parcel of the transformation of the human mind. But it's not just that, it's also that like it wasn't quite clear in what he said. What he was saying was that an alchemical mode of perception that sort of like in some sense arbitrarily assigns male and female to different objects or types of plants or of metal facilitates transformation. So it had a specific effect. What we're saying, what I'm saying at least, is that part of the reason that this kind of it's not just mythological thinking, it's a manner of involving oneself in the world that involve practice, like we were talking just before about horticultural practices, and here we're talking about smelting practices. And we're talking about the mode of perception that accompanies that involvement. And so what I'm saying is that this sexualizing of matter, this seemingly arbitrary classification of either plants or stones or metals, it facilitates the appropriate involvement in that process. Literally, like it allowed people to discover smelting in the sense of which kinds of metals go with which other kinds of metals to create material that was more useful. Okay, so I just had a break and I was thinking about what's important about this. And I had many thoughts in the past, let's say 10 minutes, about what's important about this material. And the thing that I want to emphasize is that this mythology and this kind of investigation in general is pointing to a kind of well, it's a process. There's something going on that is like there's something going on right now in this moment that is non-dual, which is beneath the layer of duality. And this kind of mythology points to that. And so when I can't work out what to say about it. It's kind of like there's a kind of self-recognition which is implied here of a certain process that I'm struggling to work out how to talk about it, but when we have this tradition, right? It's not exactly a tradition, but it's a style of sexualizing, and it's being talked about in a way which looks quite Freudian. But don't relate to it as that. Because that, like, for example, they were talking about sexualizing the world in terms of yin and yang. Well, yin and yang don't have to do just with sexuality. They have to do with duality itself. The living quality. Can you see how there's a connection between this living quality and any duality that shows up as our sexualizing? But it's not just about that. It's about a full-bodied, like of our whole being, existential participation in reality, which is happening right now and which is beneath the level of our awareness. And I'm trying to draw attention to that. And I do feel that in a sense, the tradition of alchemy and alchemizing modes of being, in a way, they take that kind of thinking and they spin off from it. So, like I was talking about how, like, there's an example of it applied to horticulture. So, an alchemical way of doing horticulture is to have this manner of participatory knowing that involves trying to graft things to other things in a way that, like, finally you find something that works after many times of trying. So it's transformative in a certain way, or it involves genesis or creation. In the same way, alchemical thinking applied to metallurgy led to the creation of new kinds of, not exactly new kinds of metal, new kinds of, is it ore? That's a combination of two. It's an alloy. And so what I'm sort of getting at here is that these examples are examples of a certain, it's not just a certain way of thinking, it's a certain kind of recognition. It's the application of this transformative process in a particular sphere applied to particular objects. It seems to me that like if we recognize that the sort of culmination of those different examples ends up being the creation of artificial breeding and GMOs, which is kind of, well, in some ways it's helpful and in some ways it's kind of terrible. And similarly, applied to metallurgy, well, it's kind of all those tools were very helpful that we created, but they're also kind of deadly. So this duality ends up being built in to that which we create. And I sort of feel that there's a tendency for our thinking to become tied to particular objects. So alchemical thinking gets tied to different species in horticulture, or alchemical thinking, which, let's say in this context, sexualizes the world into this yin and yang way of thinking, gets tied to particular objects, particular kinds of metal. And although it might be the case that our thinking sort of has to do that because we're exposed to these different kinds of things, so that's helpful, is it possible for us to step back and recognize that our own participation in life, in reality, our being, is itself that alchemical process, or it contains that process? Imagine for a second that as if we've talked about that this alchemical way of being involves a particular mode of perception. Well, it's a kind of skill, right? But beneath the level of skill, beneath the level of techne, alchemical techne, is us. And part of the reason that I think it's difficult for us to sort of turn around and apply this kind of thinking to ourself, or at least it is for me, is because it requires this capacity to take different perspectives at the same time. Because alchemically speaking, we could be that which is acted upon, which in a way I would call the yin of the pair. But we could also be that which does the acting, in which case, in a sense, we'd be the yang of the pair. And the thing is that we're both. So I'm going to boil this down to, I'm going to try and make a conclusion here and then pick up the second half of this because I kind of lost the thread of it. And I don't like to just put all this material in covered behind everything that I already said. I think what I'm saying is that we sort of fell into this mythological trap of pushing this alchemical process outside of us, like objectifying the world and sort of doing alchemy upon the world. But we, the creator, are sort of standing back here, literally like behind a screen at the moment. And it sort of there's a failure of self-recognition there. And there's a failure of recognizing that we are that which we act upon. And so like when we transform the world by creating, like say, different horticultural techniques, well, that kind of comes back to bite us through artificial, like through literally through what we eat, right? It comes back around to transforming ourselves. And in the same way as with metals, like, well, when we use those tools, they end up conditioning our consciousness very deeply. And so when we do alchemy in a way like outside of ourselves, well, then it comes back around to transform us. So I think the shift here, if alchemical, not just thinking, but an alchemical mode of participation in reality can be engaged in a more self-reflective way in order to wake ourselves up, which I think is possible. We have to be able to take up both, and in fact, all perspectives that are present. It's everything and everyone that is to be transformed, that is to be acted upon. So, for example, like the self-recognition here would be that this process is for me, right? And that by, like, again, rather than articulating for anyone else's understanding, I'm articulating for my own understanding. Because like in that very recognition, there is a kind of listening that becomes possible, which was not available before. So the way that that would end up being applied is waking up the body, waking up in the body, with the recognition that the body is part of this world, the matter that that is the world. And these kind of examples that we've been talking about, they're kind of examples that in some way it's hard to make a judgment, but it's kind of like there's a kind of we haven't been recognizing for a very, very long time how deeply we're conditioning ourselves. And if we can come through alchemical studies, let's say, to a deep kind of self-recognition of aliveness, of life itself, then we as life are that which acts upon itself alchemically. in such a way that is creative, that is generative, Ouroboros. It's that self-fertilizing quality of the Ouroboros that for me has to do with this relationship between the archetypes of 3 and 4, very much not, as I said, non-dual because it's beneath the level of duality. But that which is beneath the level, like I'm saying that when we see things in terms of, for example, male and female, that's well, it is a way that things are, right? But it's also a way of seeing, a way of being with the world in terms of those dual categories, but beneath them and before them, behind them. We are already in the world. Quote, it's the total union of reality which mattered. It's the total union of reality which matters. And this kind of that it's not just a way of thinking. Again, it's a kind of recognition. Eliade says it justifies a kind of right. I'm saying a kind of religious praxis, which, according to Eliade, it makes possible a certain kind of birth. I talked about that elsewhere in terms of Platonism and theurgy and cosmogenesis, giving birth to not just ourselves, but to a world, the world that we are.